Hello everyone, before we begin tonight's haunting tale, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a moment of the fear. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from and what time the unknown feels closest to you. Now, settle in, dim the lights, and let the whispers of the unknown guide you through the eerie corridors of our story. Ready to face the darkness? The Appalachian Mountains stretched endlessly, their jagged peaks cloaked in a tapestry of green pines and rocky outcrops. The forest, dense and seemingly untouched by time, exuded a serenity that could only be found in such remote wilderness. Ethan Moore stood at the edge of his chosen campsite, surveying the area with a practiced eye. To his left, a crystal-clear stream meandered through moss-covered rocks, its gentle burble harmonizing with the distant calls of birds. To his right, towering trees formed a natural barrier, their branches interlocking to create a canopy that filtered the sunlight into golden patches. Ethan had selected this spot not only for its beauty but for its isolation. Here, in the heart of the Appalachians, he could escape the noise of civilization and the constant reminders of the life he had left behind. The air was crisp and clean, carrying the faint scent of pine needles and damp earth. It was a place that promised peace, or so he had hoped. As the afternoon wore on, the atmosphere began to shift. The once bright sky darkened as clouds rolled in, their edges tinged with a menacing grey. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves in a way that sounded more urgent than soothing. Ethan paused, his hand hovering over the knot he was tying on his tent. He tilted his head, listening. The distant rumble of thunder reached his ears, low and growling, like a warning from the mountains themselves. "Looks like we're in for a storm," he muttered to himself, pulling his jacket tighter against the sudden chill. The wind grew stronger, carrying with it the unmistakable tang of impending rain. Ethan hurried to secure his camp, ensuring his tent was properly anchored and his supplies were safely stored. As he worked, a strange unease settled over him. It wasn't just the storm that made the hair on the back of his neck stand on end, it was something deeper, an instinctual sense that he was no longer alone. Ethan Moore was no stranger to the wilderness. A seasoned camper and avid hiker, he had spent countless nights under the stars, finding solace in nature's vastness. But this trip was different. It wasn't just another adventure, it was an escape. After the loss of his wife in a tragic accident, Ethan had thrown himself into the wilderness, seeking refuge from a world that felt too loud, too chaotic, and too painful. His friends had tried to help, suggesting therapy and support groups, but Ethan had refused. Instead, he turned to the one place where he could hear himself think, the woods. Out here, he didn't have to answer questions or pretend he was okay. He could simply exist, surrounded by the raw, untamed beauty of the natural world. Ethan was a man of quiet resilience, his strength forged through years of hardship and loss. His brown eyes, once warm and full of life, now carried a shadow of sorrow. His movements were deliberate, almost mechanical, as if each action was a distraction from the thoughts he couldn't bear to confront. The wilderness had become his sanctuary, but it was also a place of reckoning, forcing him to confront his grief in its unrelenting solitude. As he finished setting up camp, Ethan allowed himself a moment to breathe. He sat on a fallen log near the stream, sipping coffee from his battered thermos. The sound of the rushing water soothed his nerves, but the growing darkness in the sky reminded him that his peace was fleeting. The storm was coming, and with it, an unsettling sense of foreboding. The first raindrops fell as Ethan returned to his tent, their cool touch a stark contrast to the warmth of the fire he had just built. He zipped the tent closed, listening to the rhythmic patter of rain on the fabric. It was a sound he usually found comforting, but tonight, it felt different. The storm's intensity grew, the wind howling through the trees like a living thing. Thunder rolled across the mountains, each clap louder than the last. Ethan's unease deepened. He tried to shake it off, telling himself it was just the storm playing tricks on his mind. But then he heard it, a faint rustling outside the tent, too deliberate to be the wind. He froze, his heart pounding in his chest. Reaching for his flashlight, he unzipped the tent just enough to peer outside. The beam of light cut through the rain, illuminating the trees and the empty campsite. Nothing moved, but the feeling of being watched lingered. He sat back, his grip on the flashlight tightening. "Get a grip, Ethan," he muttered, though his voice lacked conviction. The sound came again, this time closer. It wasn't the rustling of leaves but the crunch of footsteps on wet ground. Ethan's pulse quickened as he strained to listen. The footsteps stopped just outside his tent, followed by a low, muffled voice. Before he could react, a shadow darkened the tent's entrance. "Hello," a voice called out, barely audible over the storm. "Is someone in there?" Ethan unzipped the tent cautiously, his flashlight illuminating the figure of a man standing in the rain. He was drenched, his clothes clinging to his wiry frame, and his face was partially obscured by the hood of his jacket. The man raised a hand in a gesture of peace, his expression one of desperation. "Sorry to bother you," the man said, his voice strained. "I got caught in the storm. Can I share your fire?" Ethan hesitated, every instinct telling him to refuse. But the man looked genuinely lost and vulnerable, and Ethan couldn't bring himself to turn him away. "Yeah," he said finally, stepping aside to let the man in. "Come on. Let's get you warmed up." The man nodded, stepping into the tent and shaking off the rain. "Thanks," he said, his voice flat but polite. "Name's Lucas. I owe you one." Ethan didn't respond immediately, his eyes scanning Lucas for anything out of the ordinary. The man's clothes were soaked, but oddly clean for someone lost in the wilderness. His movements were stiff, almost unnatural, and his eyes darted around the tent as though cataloguing its contents. Ethan's unease grew, but he forced himself to stay calm. "Ethan," he said finally, "what were you doing out here?" Lucas hesitated, then gave a half smile. "Got turned around on a hike. Didn't expect the storm to come in so fast. Lucky I found you." Ethan nodded slowly, though something about the man's tone didn't sit right. The storm raged on outside, trapping them together in the confined space of the tent. As the firelight flickered, casting long shadows on the walls, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that he had just invited something far more dangerous than the storm into his camp. The fire crackled softly in the center of the campsite, its warm glow contrasting with the relentless patter of rain against the tent. Ethan sat cross-legged near the fire, his senses alert despite his attempts to relax. Across from him, Lucas huddled close to the flames, his damp clothes steaming faintly as they dried. The stranger's presence was unsettling. Something about him felt off, but Ethan couldn't put his finger on it. Lucas had shed his rain-soaked jacket, revealing a lean frame dressed in clothes that seemed oddly pristine for someone claiming to be lost in the wilderness. His movements were deliberate but slightly awkward, as if he weren't entirely comfortable in his own skin. He avoided Ethan's gaze, his eyes instead darting around the campsite, lingering on the backpack propped against a nearby log. Ethan cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "You said you got caught in the storm. Where were you headed?" Lucas looked up, his lips curling into a faint smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Just out hiking," he said. "Thought I'd explore the area. Didn't realize how quickly the weather could change." "Hiking alone?" Ethan pressed, his tone casual but probing. Lucas shrugged. "Sometimes it's nice to get away from people, you know?" He chuckled softly, the sound hollow. "Guess you'd understand that, being out here by yourself." Ethan nodded but didn't reply. The unease in his chest grew as he studied the man across from him. Lucas's words seemed practiced, as if he were reciting a script rather than speaking honestly. Ethan's years of camping had taught him to trust his instincts, and they were screaming at him to stay cautious. As the storm raged on, the two men sat in an uneasy silence, punctuated only by the crackling fire and the occasional rumble of thunder. Ethan's mind raced with questions. How had Lucas found his campsite in the middle of the storm? Why was his gear, what little Ethan had seen of it, so clean and new? And why did he seem so interested in Ethan's backpack? Ethan decided to test the waters. "You must have some survival skills to make it through this weather," he said, keeping his tone light. "What kind of gear are you carrying?" Lucas hesitated for a fraction of a second before responding. "Not much," he said, gesturing vaguely toward the small pack he had dropped near the tent. "Couple of basics, water, a map, a knife. Enough to get by." Ethan's eyes flicked to the pack. It looked barely used, the fabric unscuffed and the zippers shiny. "Mind if I take a look at that map?" he asked. Could help me plan my route for tomorrow. Lucas's smile faltered for a moment before he recovered. Sure, he said, reaching into his pack and pulling out a neatly folded map. He handed it over, his hand lingering just a second too long. Ethan unfolded the map, pretending to study it while his eyes searched for anything unusual. The campsite was marked in red ink, a small circle drawn with meticulous precision. He felt a chill run down his spine. Nice map, he said evenly, folding it back up and handing it to Lucas. Looks like you're well prepared. Lucas nodded, his expression unreadable. I try to be. As the evening wore on, Lucas's odd behavior became more pronounced. He avoided eye contact, his gaze often drifting toward Ethan's belongings. He asked probing questions that seemed innocuous at first but quickly grew personal. So, Ethan, Lucas began, his tone casual. What brings you out here all by yourself? Looking for some kind of escape? Ethan hesitated, choosing his words carefully. Something like that, he said. Needed some time to clear my head. Lucas nodded slowly, as if digesting the answer. Must be nice, he said. No one around to bother you. No distractions. Just peace. The way he said it made Ethan's skin crawl. There was a weight to Lucas's words, a veiled meaning that Ethan couldn't quite decipher. He decided to change the subject. You mentioned you got turned around, Ethan said. How long were you out there before you found me? Lucas shrugged. Hard to say. Couple of hours, maybe. Ethan raised an eyebrow. In this storm? That's impressive. Lucas's lips twitched into another half-smile. Guess I got lucky. By the time night fell, Ethan's unease had grown into full-blown suspicion. He watched Lucas carefully, noting every movement and gesture. The man's demeanor was too controlled, too calculated. It was as if he were playing a role, trying to blend in but failing to hide the cracks in his facade. As the fire burned low, Lucas excused himself to fetch something from his pack. Ethan took the opportunity to examine his surroundings. He noticed that Lucas's boots, despite the muddy terrain, left no tracks around the campsite. The realization sent a wave of dread through him. Who or what was this man? When Lucas returned, he seemed more relaxed, almost smug. He settled back by the fire, his eyes glinting in the dim light. You know, he said, his tone conversational, it's funny how people end up in places like this. The middle of nowhere. You never know who you'll run into. Ethan forced a smile. Yeah, you never know. The fire crackled, and for a moment, neither man spoke. The storm raged on, the wind howling through the trees like a warning. Ethan tightened his grip on his flashlight, his instincts screaming at him to stay alert. Lucas might have found shelter, but he wasn't just a lost hiker. Something darker was at play, and Ethan knew he would need every ounce of his wits to uncover the truth. That night, as the storm continued to batter the campsite, Ethan lay awake in his tent, his mind racing. The stranger's arrival had shattered the peace he had sought, replacing it with a tension that felt almost tangible. The sound of the rain on the tent's fabric masked the subtler noises outside, but Ethan swore he could hear faint movements beyond the firelight's reach. He gripped his knife tightly, its reassuring weight grounding him. Whatever Lucas's intentions, Ethan was determined to stay one step ahead. The stranger's arrival had set the stage, but Ethan knew the real danger was yet to come. The fire's warm glow dimmed as the storm outside raged on, wind whipping through the trees with a ferocity that made the tent fabric ripple. Inside the tent, Ethan Moore sat on edge, acutely aware of the tension in the air. Lucas, the stranger who had stumbled into his camp, seemed calm, too calm. His every movement was measured, his presence unsettling. Ethan tried to focus on the storm, using its constant roar to drown out his unease, but Lucas's probing questions kept pulling him back into the moment. So, Ethan, Lucas said, breaking the silence. His tone was casual, almost conversational, but there was an edge to it that Ethan couldn't ignore. What's a guy like you doing out here all alone? Got family waiting for you back home? Ethan hesitated. The question wasn't unusual, but something about the way Lucas asked it felt invasive, as though he was searching for a weakness to exploit. Just needed some time to myself, Ethan replied, keeping his tone neutral. You know how it is. Lucas nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on the flickering fire. Yeah, I get it. Sometimes you just need to get away from everything, right? People, responsibilities, all of it. Ethan didn't respond, his instincts screaming at him to tread carefully. Lucas's words felt rehearsed, like he was testing the waters, trying to see how much Ethan would reveal. The silence stretched between them, heavy and charged. As the night wore on, Lucas's behavior grew increasingly strange. He seemed fixated on Ethan's backpack, his eyes darting to it whenever he thought Ethan wasn't looking. When Ethan adjusted its position, Lucas's lips twitched into a fleeting smile, as though he were amused by the attempt to guard it. "You've got some nice gear," Lucas remarked, his tone light but his eyes sharp. "Must have cost you a pretty penny. What's in there? Anything interesting?" "Just the essentials," Ethan replied curtly, his patience wearing thin. "Food, water, first aid. You know, standard stuff." Lucas tilted his head, studying Ethan with an intensity that made his skin crawl. "Bet you've got some cool gadgets in there, though. Maybe a GPS? Satellite phone?" Ethan forced a laugh. "Nah, just the basics. I like to keep it simple." Lucas's smile widened, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Smart. Real smart." The storm outside showed no signs of letting up, and the fire began to sputter as the wind pushed rain into the tent's entrance. Ethan stoked the flames, using the task as an excuse to avoid Lucas's unnerving gaze. But even as he focused on the fire, he could feel Lucas watching him, his presence a constant pressure that was impossible to ignore. "You ever hear about the disappearances around here?" Lucas asked suddenly, his voice cutting through the crackle of the fire. "Couple of hikers went missing not too far from this spot a while back. Never found them." Ethan glanced up, his grip tightening on the metal rod he was using to tend the fire. "Can't say I have," he said evenly. "But stuff like that happens in the wilderness. People get lost, storms roll in. It's dangerous out here." Lucas leaned forward, his eyes glinting in the firelight. "Yeah, dangerous. But sometimes, it's not the wilderness that gets them." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. The way Lucas said it, the deliberate pause before his last words, sent a chill down his spine. He forced himself to stay calm, refusing to let Lucas see his unease. "What do you mean?" Ethan asked, keeping his voice steady. Lucas shrugged, leaning back as if the conversation were of no consequence. "Just something I heard. Some folks say there's more out here than bears and mountain lions. Things that watch you, follow you. Wait for the right moment." Ethan swallowed hard, his mind racing. He didn't believe in ghost stories or urban legends, but Lucas's tone made it hard to dismiss the possibility that there was more to his words than mere superstition. The night dragged on, the storm showing no mercy. Ethan lay in his tent, wide awake despite his exhaustion. Lucas had retired to his own small tent, but Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that he was still being watched. Every rustle of the wind, every creak of the trees sounded like footsteps approaching his camp. He tightened his grip on the knife hidden beneath his sleeping bag, the cold steel reassuring against his palm. He had always felt safe in the wilderness, but tonight was different. Tonight, the forest felt alive, its shadows stretching and shifting in ways that defied explanation. A sudden noise snapped him out of his thoughts. It was faint but distinct, a low whisper, carried on the wind. Ethan froze, his breath catching in his throat. The sound was coming from outside his tent, near the dying embers of the fire. Carefully, he unzipped the tent just enough to peer out. The firelight cast long shadows across the campsite, but everything seemed still. He scanned the area, his heart pounding. And then he saw it, Lucas, standing near the fire, his back to Ethan. He wasn't moving, just staring into the flames. Ethan watched him for a moment, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. Lucas's posture was rigid, his head tilted slightly as though listening to something only he could hear. The whispers grew louder, filling Ethan's ears, though he couldn't understand the words. "Lucas!" Ethan called out, his voice barely above a whisper. Lucas didn't respond. He remained motionless, his gaze fixed on the fire. Ethan felt a surge of fear, his instincts screaming at him to stay in the tent. But curiosity and concern won out, and he stepped outside, his knife clutched tightly in his hand. As Ethan approached, Lucas finally turned to face him. His expression was blank, his eyes glassy and unfocused. For a moment, Ethan thought he was sleepwalking, but then Lucas spoke. "They're here," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "They've always been here." Ethan took a step back, his grip on the knife tightening. "What are you talking about?" he demanded. Lucas didn't answer. Instead, he raised his arm and pointed toward the tree line. Ethan followed his gaze, his heart sinking as he saw faint, shadowy figures moving between the trees. Their shapes were indistinct, their movements unnatural, as though they were gliding rather than walking. The whispers grew louder, filling the air with an eerie, almost melodic cadence. Ethan's mind raced, every survival instinct screaming at him to run. But his legs felt rooted to the ground, his body frozen in a mix of fear and disbelief. "Lucas," he said, his voice trembling. "What's going on? Who are they?" Lucas smiled, a chilling expression that sent a shiver down Ethan's spine. "You'll see," he said softly. "Soon enough, you'll see." The storm showed no signs of abating as the early hours of the morning crept in. Rain battered the tent in relentless sheets, accompanied by the low, menacing growl of thunder. Ethan lay awake, his senses heightened, every creak of the forest amplified by his growing unease. Across the fire's dim remnants, Lucas's tent remained eerily still, its shadowed outline motionless against the flickering light. Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. As dawn approached, the first sign of trouble emerged. Ethan stepped outside to tend to the fire and inspect his surroundings, only to find fresh claw marks gouged into the bark of a tree near the campsite. They were deep and jagged, unlike anything a bear or mountain lion could make. His stomach churned as he traced the lines with his fingers, their sharp edges still damp from the storm. Whatever had made them had been there recently. Lucas emerged from his tent shortly after, his expression unreadable. He glanced at the claw marks but said nothing, his silence only adding to the tension. "Looks like something big came through here last night," Ethan said, trying to gauge Lucas's reaction. Lucas shrugged, his movements uncharacteristically fluid. "It's the wilderness," he replied. "Things happen." Ethan's grip tightened on his knife. "Not like this," he muttered under his breath. As the day wore on, Ethan's unease deepened. The forest seemed unnaturally quiet, its usual chorus of birds and insects replaced by an oppressive silence. Even the wind had died down, leaving the air thick and still. Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, though by what or whom, he couldn't say. The second sign came while Ethan was scouting for firewood. He stumbled upon a small clearing littered with debris, torn fabric, shattered camping equipment, and what looked like the remnants of a backpack. The sight stopped him in his tracks, his heart racing as he crouched to examine the scene. The gear was old but not ancient, the kind used by hikers in the last decade. Scratches marred the plastic and metal surfaces, as though they'd been raked by something with claws. Among the wreckage, Ethan found a water bottle etched with initials, LW. He pocketed it, his mind racing with questions. Had Lucas lied about being a solo hiker? Or was he connected to the disappearances in ways Ethan didn't yet understand? The thought sent a chill down his spine. When Ethan returned to camp, Lucas was waiting for him, sitting by the fire with an air of quiet confidence. He glanced at Ethan's hands, his eyes narrowing slightly when he saw the water bottle. "Find something interesting?" he asked, his tone deceptively casual. Ethan hesitated, then shook his head. "Just some old trash. Probably from campers who passed through years ago." Lucas nodded slowly, his gaze lingering on Ethan for a moment too long before he turned back to the fire. "Yeah," he said. "Probably." The third sign came that evening. As the storm picked up again, Ethan noticed faint footprints leading away from the camp. They were shallow and irregular, as though someone or something had been walking barefoot through the mud. The prints were larger than a human's, with elongated toes and deep impressions where claws might have sunk into the earth. They circled the campsite before disappearing into the trees. Ethan's pulse quickened as he followed the trail, his flashlight cutting through the rain and darkness. The prints led him to a spot near the stream, where he found more claw marks etched into a large rock. The marks formed a pattern, almost like symbols, though their meaning was indecipherable. He snapped a photo with his phone, his hands trembling as he worked. A sudden noise made him spin around, his flashlight beam catching the glint of eyes in the darkness. For a moment, he thought he saw a figure standing just beyond the tree line, its form tall and thin, its face obscured by shadow. But when he blinked, it was gone, leaving only the sound of rustling leaves in its wake. Back at camp, Lucas was waiting again, his expression calm but his posture unnervingly stiff. He watched silently as Ethan approached, his eyes following the flashlight beam as it swept over the trees. "Find anything?" Lucas asked, his voice cutting through the storm's din. Ethan hesitated, then shook his head. "Nothing worth mentioning." Lucas smirked, the corners of his mouth twitching upward. "That's funny," he said. "I thought I heard you talking to someone out there." Ethan's blood ran cold. "Must have been the wind," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. Lucas chuckled softly, the sound unnerving in its simplicity. "Yeah," he said. "Must have been." The final sign came in the dead of night. Ethan lay in his tent, clutching his knife and listening to the storm. He had barely slept, his mind racing with thoughts of the claw marks, the footprints, and the eerie figure he thought he'd seen. Every instinct told him to pack up and leave, but the storm made escape impossible. Then he heard it, a faint, rhythmic tapping against the side of his tent. At first, he thought it was a branch swaying in the wind, but the sound was too deliberate, too steady. He sat up, his heart pounding as he listened. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, until it stopped abruptly. Ethan unzipped the tent and peered out into the darkness. The fire had died down to embers, casting long, flickering shadows across the campsite. Lucas's tent was still, but Ethan could see faint movement inside, as though he were pacing back and forth. A flash of lightning illuminated the forest, and Ethan's breath caught in his throat. Standing at the edge of the campsite was a figure, tall, gaunt, and shrouded in shadow. Its eyes glowed faintly, reflecting the firelight like twin embers. It didn't move, but Ethan could feel its gaze boring into him, its presence suffocating. "Lucas," Ethan whispered, his voice trembling. "Wake up." Lucas's tent unzipped slowly, and he emerged, his movements unnervingly fluid. He didn't look at Ethan or the figure but instead turned toward the fire, tossing a log onto the embers. The flames roared to life, casting a harsh light over the campsite. When Ethan looked back toward the figure, it was gone. The forest was empty, the only sound the relentless drum of rain against the earth. But the sense of danger lingered, heavy and oppressive, as though the forest itself were holding its breath. Lucas turned to Ethan, his expression unreadable. "You should get some rest," he said, his tone almost gentle. "Big day tomorrow." Ethan didn't respond. He retreated into his tent, his mind racing. The signs were clear, whatever was happening in the forest, it wasn't natural. And Lucas wasn't just another stranded hiker. He was something else entirely, something far more dangerous. As the storm raged on, Ethan tightened his grip on his knife, his resolve hardening. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but he knew one thing for certain: he couldn't trust Lucas. And he couldn't let his guard down, not for a second. The storm reached its peak in the dead of night, the wind howling through the trees like a primal scream. Ethan lay in his tent, his eyes fixed on the fabric above him as it shuddered with each gust. Sleep was impossible. The events of the past day replayed in his mind, the claw marks, the footprints, and the shadowy figure that seemed to stalk him at every turn. And then there was Lucas, whose presence only deepened Ethan's unease. He tightened his grip on the knife hidden beneath his sleeping bag, its cold handle grounding him. Whatever was out there, he needed to be ready. The first hint of trouble came just past midnight. A sound outside Ethan's tent made his pulse quicken, a soft shuffling, followed by the unmistakable crunch of footsteps on wet earth. He sat up, every muscle in his body tense, and listened. The footsteps grew louder, circling the tent in slow, deliberate movements. Ethan's mind raced. It couldn't be Lucas. He had retreated to his own tent hours ago. So who, or what, was it? Ethan reached for his flashlight and unzipped the tent just enough to peer outside. The beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but the rain-soaked campsite. The fire had died down to glowing embers, casting faint, flickering shadows across the trees. Ethan scanned the area, his heart pounding in his chest. The footsteps had stopped, but the oppressive feeling of being watched lingered. He was about to retreat back into the tent when a voice broke the silence. "You're awake." Ethan whipped the flashlight toward the sound, illuminating Lucas, who stood just outside his tent. Rain dripped from his hood, his face partially obscured by the shadows. "Couldn't sleep," Ethan replied, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. "What are you doing out here?" Lucas shrugged, his movements unnervingly fluid. "Just checking on the camp. Thought I heard something." Ethan's grip on the flashlight tightened. "Yeah, me too." The two men stood in silence for a moment, the rain pattering around them. Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that Lucas knew more than he was letting on. The man's calm demeanor was unsettling, as though he were completely unfazed by the strange occurrences that had plagued their campsite. "You should get some rest," Lucas said finally, his tone almost soothing. "Big day tomorrow." Ethan nodded but didn't respond. He watched as Lucas retreated to his tent, his movements deliberate and precise. Once Lucas was out of sight, Ethan returned to his own tent, his mind racing. Something was coming. He could feel it. Hours passed in tense silence, the storm raging outside. Ethan's exhaustion finally began to take its toll, and he drifted into a fitful sleep. His dreams were fragmented and chaotic, filled with images of glowing eyes, distorted figures, and Lucas's unsettling grin. He woke with a start, his body drenched in sweat despite the cold. It took him a moment to realize that the storm had quieted. The wind had died down, and the rain had turned to a soft drizzle. The sudden stillness was almost more unnerving than the chaos that had preceded it. Ethan sat up, his ears straining for any sound. Then he heard it, a low, rhythmic chant, barely audible over the rain. He froze, his breath catching in his throat. The chant seemed to come from all around him, echoing through the forest in an otherworldly cadence. It was unlike anything he had ever heard, the words guttural and indecipherable. Ethan unzipped his tent and stepped outside, the cool rain hitting his face as he scanned the campsite. Lucas was nowhere to be seen. Ethan's flashlight beam swept over the empty campsite, illuminating the remnants of the fire and the rain-slicked ground. The chanting grew louder, drawing his attention toward the tree line. Shadows shifted between the trees, their movements too fluid and fast to be human. Ethan's grip tightened on the knife in his hand as he took a step forward, his instincts screaming at him to turn back. "Lucas," he called out, his voice trembling. "Where are you?" The chanting stopped abruptly, leaving a deafening silence in its wake. Ethan's heart pounded as he scanned the forest, his flashlight casting long, flickering shadows. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw movement. A figure stepped out from the trees, its silhouette tall and gaunt, its features obscured by the darkness. "Lucas," Ethan repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. The figure took another step forward, and Ethan's blood ran cold. It wasn't Lucas. The figure's limbs were too long, its movements unnaturally jerky, as though it were a puppet being controlled by invisible strings. Its eyes glowed faintly, reflecting the light of the fire. Ethan stumbled back, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. He raised the flashlight, the beam illuminating the creature's face. It was human, and yet not. Its features were distorted, its skin pale and stretched tight over its bones. Its mouth twisted into a grotesque grin, revealing rows of jagged teeth. Before Ethan could react, the creature let out a low, guttural growl and lunged toward him. He barely managed to dodge, the knife in his hand slashing through the air as he scrambled back toward the fire. The creature stopped just short of the flames, its glowing eyes narrowing as it hissed in frustration. Ethan's mind raced. The fire seemed to be keeping the creature at bay, but he knew it wouldn't last long. He needed to find Lucas, needed answers. Summoning his courage, he turned and ran toward the tree line, the flashlight beam bouncing wildly as he moved. The forest closed in around him, the trees looming like sentinels in the darkness. The chanting started again, louder this time, as though the entire forest had joined in. Ethan pushed forward, his breath ragged and his legs burning with exertion. He didn't know where he was going, only that he had to keep moving. Then he saw it, a faint glow in the distance. He stumbled toward it, the light growing brighter with each step. When he finally reached the source, he froze. Lucas stood in the center of a small clearing, his arms raised as he chanted in the same guttural language Ethan had heard earlier. Around him, symbols carved into the ground glowed with an eerie light, their shapes twisting and shifting as though alive. "Lucas!" Ethan shouted, his voice cutting through the chant. "What the hell is going on?" Lucas turned to face him, his expression calm but his eyes cold. "You shouldn't have followed me," he said. "This was never meant for you." Ethan raised the knife, his hands trembling. "What are you talking about? What is this?" Lucas stepped forward, the glowing symbols casting his face in an otherworldly light. "It's too late to stop it now," he said. "They're already here." As he spoke, the shadows in the clearing began to move, coalescing into humanoid forms with glowing eyes and elongated limbs. Ethan's grip on the knife tightened as he realized the full extent of the danger he was in. The catalyst had been set, and there was no turning back. Ethan's breath came in short, shallow gasps as he stood frozen at the edge of the glowing clearing. The pulsating light from the carved symbols illuminated Lucas, who stood in the center of the ritual site, his arms raised as if in supplication. The shadows around him swirled and shifted, their movements too fluid and unnatural to be mere tricks of the light. For a moment, Ethan considered running, but the pressing need for answers anchored him in place. "Lucas," Ethan called out, his voice trembling with both fear and anger. "What are you doing? What is this?" Lucas lowered his arms slowly, turning to face Ethan with a serene expression that only heightened the sense of dread. His eyes glinted with an unnatural light, as though the ritual's energy had infused him with something otherworldly. "You shouldn't have come here," Lucas said, his tone calm but carrying an edge of finality. "This isn't a place for you." Ethan tightened his grip on the knife in his hand, his knuckles turning white. "Stop speaking in riddles. What's going on? Why are you doing this?" Lucas tilted his head, studying Ethan with a faint smile that sent a chill down his spine. "Do you really think this is about me?" he asked. "I'm just a vessel. A guide. The forest chose me to carry out its will, just as it's choosing now to reveal the truth to you." Ethan's eyes darted to the swirling shadows, which had begun to coalesce into humanoid forms. Their glowing eyes pierced the darkness, and their elongated limbs seemed to shimmer and ripple as they moved closer. He took a step back, his mind racing to process what he was seeing. "You're insane," he said, though the words felt hollow even as they left his lips. "This isn't real. It can't be." Lucas let out a low chuckle, the sound devoid of humor. "Oh, it's real," he said. "More real than anything you've ever known. The forest is alive, Ethan. It sees, it hears, and it remembers. And tonight, it's reclaiming what was taken." As Lucas spoke, the symbols on the ground flared brighter, their twisting shapes casting eerie shadows across the clearing. The chanting grew louder, a guttural, rhythmic sound that seemed to resonate deep within Ethan's chest. He felt a strange pressure in the air, as if the very fabric of reality were bending around him. "What do you mean, reclaiming?" Ethan demanded, his voice rising in desperation. "What does the forest want?" Lucas's smile faded, replaced by a look of solemnity. "Balance," he said simply. "4 centuries, people like you have taken from this land without giving anything back. You've desecrated sacred places, destroyed life for your own gain, and left behind only ruin. The forest doesn't forget, and it doesn't forgive." Ethan shook his head, his mind reeling. "I didn't do anything," he said. "I came here to escape, to find peace. I didn't harm anything." Lucas stepped closer, his gaze piercing. "You're part of the cycle, whether you realize it or not. The forest isn't punishing you, it's showing you the truth. And the truth is terrifying." The shadows around them began to take on more defined shapes, their movements becoming deliberate and purposeful. Ethan watched in horror as one of the figures stepped fully into the light, revealing a gaunt, skeletal form with skin stretched taut over its bones. Its eyes glowed with an otherworldly intensity, and its mouth twisted into a grotesque grin. "Do you see them now?" Lucas asked, his voice almost reverent. These are the guardians of the forest. Spirits born of anger, of pain, of vengeance. They've been here long before us, and they'll remain long after we're gone. Ethan took another step back, his heart pounding. If they're guardians, why are they attacking me? What do they want from me? Lucas's expression softened, as if he pitied Ethan's ignorance. They don't want to hurt you, he said. Not yet. They want you to understand. To see the forest as it truly is. Ethan's mind raced, his thoughts a chaotic blur. The creature before him took another step forward, its movements slow and deliberate, as though it were testing him. Ethan raised his knife, the blade trembling in his hand. Stay back, he warned, his voice cracking. The creature paused, tilting its head as if studying him. For a moment, it seemed almost curious, its glowing eyes narrowing. Then it opened its mouth, letting out a low, guttural sound that sent a shiver down Ethan's spine. The noise wasn't quite a growl, nor was it a word, it was something in between, a sound that seemed to resonate with the symbols on the ground. Lucas watched the exchange with a calm, detached demeanor. They're giving you a choice, he said. Stay and face the truth, or run and remain blind. Either way, the forest will decide your fate. Ethan's mind raced as he weighed his options. He couldn't trust Lucas, but he couldn't ignore the overwhelming sense that he was on the precipice of something far greater than himself. The creatures, the symbols, the chanting, it all pointed to a truth that defied logic, a truth that demanded acknowledgement. Summoning his courage, Ethan lowered the knife slightly, his gaze locked on the creature before him. What do you want me to do? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Lucas smiled, his eyes glinting with approval. Listen, he said. Let the forest speak to you. The chanting reached a crescendo, the sound vibrating through the clearing. The symbols flared brighter, their light blinding as the creatures closed in. Ethan felt his knees buckle, his vision swimming as the pressure in the air intensified. He fell to the ground, his knife slipping from his grasp as darkness enveloped him. When Ethan opened his eyes, he was no longer in the clearing. He found himself in a vast, shadowy expanse, the air thick with the scent of earth and decay. The creatures surrounded him, their glowing eyes watching in silence. In the distance, he could see the faint outline of a massive tree, its gnarled branches reaching toward the sky. A voice echoed through the void, deep and resonant. Do you see now? It asked. Do you understand? Ethan struggled to his feet, his body trembling. What is this place? He demanded. What do you want from me? This is the heart of the forest, the voice replied. The place where all truths are revealed. You are here to witness, to learn, and to choose. Ethan looked around, his mind reeling. The creatures remained motionless, their presence oppressive yet strangely comforting. He took a step toward the tree, drawn by an inexplicable pull. As he approached, the voice spoke again. Will you protect the balance, or will you fall like those before you? Ethan hesitated, his heart pounding. The weight of the question pressed down on him, the truth of the forest demanding an answer. He closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and prepared to face the decision that would define his fate. Ethan's heartbeat thundered in his ears as he stumbled backward, away from the glowing clearing and the twisted figures emerging from the shadows. The weight of Lucas's cryptic warnings and the terrifying presence of the guardians pressed heavily on him. He couldn't think, couldn't plan, his instinct screamed one thing: run. The guttural chanting from the creatures grew louder, each syllable resonating with a primal energy that seemed to vibrate through the very ground beneath him. The pulsating symbols on the forest floor cast an unnatural light, elongating the shadows of the trees into grotesque shapes. As the pressure in the air grew unbearable, Ethan turned and bolted into the dense forest, his breath ragged and his flashlight beam bouncing wildly in the dark. The forest seemed alive, the trees twisting and leaning toward him as though trying to block his escape. Branches clawed at his clothes and skin, leaving scratches that burned as if laced with fire. Behind him, he could hear the pursuit, the rustling of leaves, the snapping of twigs, and that horrible, rhythmic chanting that never faltered. He didn't dare look back. Ethan's boots sank into the muddy ground, his footing unsteady as he pushed through the dense undergrowth. The storm, though quieter than before, still drenched the forest in a relentless downpour, turning the terrain into a treacherous quagmire. He stumbled and fell, his hands plunging into the cold, wet earth. Scrambling to his feet, he realized the chanting had stopped. The silence was more terrifying than the noise. He whipped his flashlight around, its beam slicing through the rain and mist, but he saw nothing, only the endless stretch of trees, their gnarled branches reaching like skeletal hands. His chest heaved as he struggled to catch his breath, his mind racing. Had he lost them? Or were they waiting, stalking him from the shadows? A sound behind him, a low, guttural growl, sent a jolt of adrenaline through his body. He spun around, his flashlight illuminating one of the creatures. It stood just a few feet away, its skeletal frame towering over him, its glowing eyes locked onto his. Ethan froze, his grip on the flashlight tightening as he raised it like a weapon. The creature tilted its head, its movements unnaturally smooth, before lunging at him with startling speed. Ethan dove to the side, the creature's clawed hand swiping through the air where he had just been. He hit the ground hard, the impact knocking the wind out of him. Scrambling to his feet, he swung the flashlight at the creature, the beam striking its face and causing it to recoil. The light seemed to weaken it, its form flickering and distorting like a poorly tuned television signal. Realizing this, Ethan turned the flashlight on full power and shone it directly at the creature. It let out a horrible screech, its body convulsing as it retreated into the shadows. But the victory was short-lived, more glowing eyes appeared in the darkness, closing in from all sides. Ethan ran again, his legs burning with exertion as he navigated the treacherous terrain. The forest seemed to conspire against him, the ground uneven and littered with roots that threatened to trip him with every step. The glowing eyes followed him, their numbers multiplying as the guardians emerged from the shadows. They were herding him, driving him deeper into the forest. He came to a ravine, its sheer drop hidden by the swirling mist. Behind him, the guardians closed in, their guttural growls echoing through the trees. Trapped, Ethan searched frantically for an escape. His flashlight beam caught a narrow ledge running along the side of the ravine. It was risky, but it was his only chance. Carefully, he edged onto the ledge, his back pressed against the cold, damp rock. The rain made the surface slick, and every step felt like it could be his last. Below him, the ravine yawned like a dark abyss, its depths obscured by fog. The guardians didn't follow. They stood at the edge, their glowing eyes watching him intently. For a moment, Ethan thought he was safe. Then the chanting began again. The symbols on the ground flared to life, their pulsating light spreading like veins through the forest floor. Ethan felt the air grow heavy, each breath a struggle as the oppressive energy of the ritual closed in around him. The guardians began to change, their forms shifting and merging until they became a singular entity, a massive, amorphous shadow that loomed over the ravine. The shadow moved with a deliberate, predatory grace, its glowing eyes multiplying and scattering across its form like embers in a dying fire. Ethan's flashlight flickered as the shadow approached, its presence distorting the light as if consuming it. He took another step along the ledge, his heart pounding. The rock beneath him crumbled slightly, sending a cascade of pebbles into the abyss below. "Ethan!" Lucas's voice cut through the noise, startling him. He looked up to see Lucas standing at the edge of the ravine, his arms outstretched. His face was a mask of calm resolve, but his eyes burned with the same eerie light as the guardians. "Come back," Lucas called. "You don't understand what you're running from. The forest doesn't want to hurt you, it wants to save you. Save me," Ethan shouted, his voice trembling with anger and fear. "From what?" "From you." "From yourself," Lucas replied, his tone almost pleading. "The forest shows you what you refuse to see. It reveals the truth you've buried. Stop running and face it." Ethan shook his head, his grip on the flashlight tightening. "You're insane," he said. "Stay away from me." The shadow lunged toward him, its amorphous form flowing like liquid as it closed the distance. Ethan turned the flashlight on it, the beam cutting through the darkness and causing the shadow to recoil. But it wasn't enough. The shadow split into smaller tendrils, each one writhing and reaching for him. He swung the flashlight wildly, the beam scattering them but never for long. The ledge began to crumble beneath his feet, the rock weakened by the rain and the relentless assault of the shadow. Ethan's mind raced. He couldn't fight the shadow, not like this. He needed to outthink it, to use the environment to his advantage. Looking down, he noticed a fallen tree spanning the ravine a few feet below. It was risky, but it was his only shot. He jumped. Ethan landed hard on the tree trunk, his arms flailing as he struggled to maintain his balance. The shadow hesitated, its form rippling as if confused by his sudden move. Ethan didn't wait for it to recover. He crawled along the tree, his flashlight tucked under one arm as he moved as quickly as he could. The shadow surged forward, its tendrils wrapping around the tree and shaking it violently. Ethan clung to the trunk, his heart pounding as the rough bark scraped against his palms. He could feel the shadow's energy, a cold, malevolent force that seemed to seep into his very bones. As he neared the other side of the ravine, he spotted a large boulder perched precariously on the edge. An idea formed in his mind. If he could dislodge the boulder, he might be able to break the tree and send the shadow tumbling into the abyss. Summoning every ounce of strength, Ethan climbed onto the boulder and began to push. The rain made the surface slick, but he dug his boots into the mud, his muscles straining with the effort. The shadow's tendrils wrapped around the tree, pulling it closer to the edge. Ethan let out a primal scream as he gave one final push. The boulder tipped, crashing into the tree with a deafening crack. The trunk splintered and broke, sending the shadow and the remains of the tree plummeting into the darkness below. Ethan collapsed to the ground, his chest heaving as he watched the shadow's glowing eyes fade into the abyss. For a moment, there was silence. Then, faintly, the chanting began again, echoing from somewhere deep within the ravine. Ethan's blood ran cold. He hadn't defeated it, not completely. But for now, he was alive. And he intended to stay that way. Ethan stumbled forward, his breath ragged and his body aching from the harrowing escape. The storm had lessened, but the forest remained shrouded in darkness, its oppressive energy clinging to the air like a suffocating fog. His flashlight flickered weakly, the beam barely cutting through the shadows. He knew he couldn't run forever. Whatever was hunting him wouldn't stop until it claimed him, or he found a way to end this nightmare. He reached a small clearing, the ground littered with fallen branches and jagged rocks. In the center stood a massive, gnarled tree, its twisted roots clawing at the earth. The air around it seemed heavier, thicker, as if the tree itself were alive and pulsing with a dark, ancient power. Ethan's instincts told him this was no ordinary tree, it was the heart of the forest's curse, the source of the malevolence that had been unleashed. A low growl echoed from the shadows, and Ethan turned sharply, raising his flashlight. The glowing eyes of the guardians appeared one by one, surrounding the clearing. Their forms were more defined now, their skeletal frames and elongated limbs twisted into grotesque parodies of humanity. Leading them was Lucas, his face a mask of calm intensity, his eyes glowing with the same eerie light as the creatures. "You can't run anymore, Ethan," Lucas said, his voice carrying a strange resonance that seemed to vibrate through the air. "This is where it ends." Ethan tightened his grip on the knife in his hand, his pulse pounding in his ears. "What do you want from me?" he demanded, his voice cracking with a mix of fear and defiance. "Why are you doing this?" Lucas stepped closer, the guardians advancing with him. "It's not about what I want," he said. "It's about balance. The forest has been scarred by greed and destruction, its sacred ground defiled. This is the price of humanity's arrogance. But you have a choice." Ethan backed away, his mind racing. The guardians closed in, their guttural growls growing louder, their movements deliberate and predatory. He knew he couldn't fight them all, but he couldn't give in, either. His eyes darted to the massive tree in the center of the clearing. If Lucas was right and this place was the source of the forest's power, then perhaps it was also the key to breaking the curse. The first guardian lunged at him, its clawed hand swiping through the air. Ethan dodged, narrowly avoiding its attack, and slashed at it with his knife. The blade connected, but instead of flesh, it struck something hard and unyielding, sending a jolt up his arm. The creature recoiled, its form flickering like a shadow caught in a strong wind. Lucas watched the struggle with an almost serene expression, his arms folded across his chest. "You can't fight them," he said. "They're not bound by the rules of your world. But you can end this another way." Ethan ignored him, his focus on the immediate threat. Another guardian lunged, and he swung the flashlight, the beam slicing through the darkness and causing the creature to falter. He realized the light still had some effect, but it wasn't enough. He needed more, something stronger, something permanent. His gaze returned to the tree. The symbols carved into its bark glowed faintly, their pulsating light syncing with the guardian's movements. The connection was clear now. The tree was their anchor, their source of power. If he could destroy it, maybe he could sever their link to the forest. Summoning his courage, Ethan made a dash for the tree, weaving through the guardians as they clawed and swiped at him. He reached the base of the massive trunk and placed a hand on its rough surface. A surge of energy coursed through him, a mix of pain and clarity that left him gasping. Visions flashed before his eyes, images of the forest's desecration, of ancient rituals performed in this very spot, of Lucas standing in the shadows, watching. "Stop!" Lucas's voice rang out, sharp and commanding. He approached with deliberate steps, his calm demeanor replaced by urgency. "You don't understand what you're doing. If you destroy the tree, you destroy the balance. The forest will die." Ethan turned to face him, his jaw set with determination. "Maybe it's better that way," he said. "Better than letting this madness continue." Lucas shook his head, his expression pained. "You don't get it, do you? The forest isn't your enemy. It's trying to heal. All it needs is someone willing to protect it, to restore what's been lost. You can be that person, Ethan. You can be its guardian." The guardians began to close in, their growls a deafening chorus. Ethan's mind raced. He didn't trust Lucas, but there was truth in his words. The visions had shown him the forest suffering, its desperate need for balance. Destroying the tree might end the curse, but it would also doom the forest and everything within it. Ethan's grip on the knife tightened as he weighed his options. The guardians were almost upon him, their twisted forms blocking any chance of escape. He glanced at the tree, then at Lucas, and made his decision. He dropped the knife and stepped back from the tree, his hands raised in surrender. "What do I have to do?" he asked, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. Lucas's expression softened, a flicker of relief crossing his face. "Trust me," he said. "The forest will guide you." The guardians stopped their advance, their glowing eyes fixed on Ethan. The air grew still, the oppressive energy lifting slightly as the symbols on the tree pulsed with a softer light. Lucas stepped forward, his hand outstretched. "This isn't the end," he said. "It's the beginning." Ethan hesitated, then reached out and took Lucas's hand. The moment their hands touched, the symbols flared brightly, and a wave of energy erupted from the tree, enveloping them both. The guardians dissolved into shadows, their forms scattering like smoke in the wind. The forest grew silent, its oppressive presence replaced by a profound stillness. Ethan collapsed to the ground, his vision swimming as the energy coursed through him. The last thing he saw before darkness took him was Lucas's face, a faint smile playing on his lips. When Ethan woke, the storm had passed. The forest was bathed in the soft light of dawn, its trees swaying gently in the breeze. The massive tree in the clearing was gone, its roots and trunk reduced to a circle of ash. Ethan sat up, his body aching but his mind clear. Lucas was gone. Whether he had been consumed by the ritual or had simply vanished, Ethan didn't know. But he felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years, a connection to the forest that defied explanation. He stood, his gaze sweeping over the clearing, and knew his journey wasn't over. The forest had chosen him, just as Lucas had said. Now it was up to him to protect it, to restore the balance that had been broken. As he walked away from the clearing, the morning light guiding his path, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. The storm had ended, but the stranger's legacy remained. And Ethan was ready to face whatever came next. The forest was silent, its stillness almost reverent in the aftermath of the night's turmoil. Ethan stood in the clearing, his breath steadying as he surveyed the remnants of the gnarled tree that had once dominated the space. The circle of ash where it had stood seemed to pulse faintly, as if the energy that had driven the forest's curse had not been fully extinguished, only quelled. Ethan's body ached with exhaustion, his muscles protesting every movement as he knelt to inspect the ground. The soil felt warm beneath his fingers, as though the forest itself was healing. Despite the pain and the lingering weight of fear, a strange calm had settled over him. The oppressive atmosphere that had once suffocated the woods was gone, replaced by an uneasy serenity. He stood slowly, his eyes scanning the clearing. Lucas was nowhere to be seen. Whether the forest had claimed him, or he had chosen to disappear into its depths, Ethan couldn't say. All that remained was the memory of Lucas's final words and the profound truth they carried. The forest needed balance, and Ethan had been given a role in restoring it. As he made his way back toward the trailhead, the first rays of sunlight pierced through the canopy, illuminating the forest in a golden glow. The storm had stripped the trees of some of their leaves, leaving the ground carpeted in shades of green and brown. Ethan's steps were slow and deliberate, each one a reminder of the journey he had undertaken and the toll it had exacted. Passing through familiar landmarks, he couldn't help but notice the subtle changes in the forest. The oppressive energy was gone, but there was an underlying tension, a sense that the forest was watching, waiting. The whispers he had heard in the storm's height had vanished, replaced by the gentle rustle of leaves and the distant calls of birds. It was as if the forest was taking its first cautious breaths after a long and harrowing ordeal. Reaching a small stream, Ethan paused to kneel by the water's edge. He splashed the cool liquid onto his face, letting it wash away the grime and blood that clung to his skin. As he stared at his reflection, he barely recognized the man looking back. His eyes, once clouded by grief and doubt, now held a steely resolve. He had come to the forest seeking solace, but he was leaving with something far more profound, a purpose. Back at the campsite, Ethan gathered his scattered belongings. The tent was damp and torn, a casualty of the night's chaos. His supplies were mudded, his flashlight flickering weakly in protest. Yet he felt no frustration, no anger, only gratitude that he had survived. He packed everything methodically, his movements steady despite the lingering soreness in his limbs. As he secured the last strap on his pack, he noticed something glinting in the morning light. Kneeling, he found a small object partially buried in the dirt. It was Lucas's talisman, the one he had used to guide the ritual. The intricately carved piece of wood felt warm in his hand, its surface etched with symbols that seemed to shift and shimmer when held to the light. Ethan slipped the talisman into his pocket, its weight both comforting and foreboding. He didn't fully understand its significance, but he knew it was a part of the forest story, and now, a part of his own. The trailhead came into view just as the sun rose fully above the horizon, bathing the landscape in light. Ethan paused at the edge of the forest, his gaze lingering on the dense trees behind him. He had come here to escape, to find peace in isolation. Instead, he had been thrust into a battle for survival, one that had changed him in ways he was only beginning to comprehend. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the talisman, turning it over in his hand. The forest had given him a choice, and he had made it. Now, it was his responsibility to ensure that choice wasn't in vain. With a deep breath, he stepped onto the gravel path leading away from the forest. Each step felt heavy, the weight of the night's events pressing down on him. Yet with every step, that weight began to lighten, replaced by a sense of determination. He didn't know what lay ahead, but he knew one thing for certain: he wouldn't run from the forest's truth. Not anymore. Weeks later, back in his small apartment, Ethan sat at his desk, the talisman resting beside a stack of notebooks filled with hastily scrawled observations. He had spent every moment since his return researching the forest, its history, and the legends surrounding it. The internet was full of stories, some wild and exaggerated, others eerily similar to his own experience. But none of them provided the answers he sought. His laptop screen glowed with the faint light of an open document. The cursor blinked at the top of a blank page, waiting for him to begin. Ethan hesitated, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. How could he put into words what he had seen, what he had felt? Would anyone believe him? And even if they did, would they understand the forest's need for balance, its plea for respect and reverence? A knock at the door startled him, breaking his train of thought. Ethan rose, his heart pounding as he approached. Through the peephole, he saw nothing but the dimly lit hallway. He opened the door cautiously, half expecting to see Lucas or one of the guardians standing there. Instead, he found a package resting on the floor. It was small and unmarked, with no return address. Ethan picked it up, his hands trembling slightly as he carried it to the table. He opened it carefully, his breath catching as he pulled out its contents. Inside was a map, similar to the one he had found in Lucas's possession. But this map was different. It bore new markings, trails that hadn't been on the original, and a small red X near the center of the forest. Alongside the map was a single piece of paper, folded neatly. Unfolding it, Ethan read the words written in an unfamiliar hand. "The forest isn't done with you." Ethan sat back, the talisman warm in his pocket, the map spread out before him. The forest's call was unmistakable, its pull as strong as ever. He didn't know what awaited him at the marked location, but he knew he had to find out. The balance of the forest depended on it, and perhaps, so did he. As he packed his gear for another journey, Ethan glanced out the window at the city beyond. The world seemed so far removed from the forest's truths, its people oblivious to the ancient forces that shaped their existence. But he wasn't oblivious. He had seen the shadows, heard the whispers, and felt the forest's pain. And he was ready to face it again.